In this lecture, I plan to talk about Alexander's self-image and how he came to regard himself as, in some sense, divine. And that has to be qualified because in the Greek world and the Macedonian world, the distinction between divinity and mortality was never quite strongly drawn. The stories about Heracles and the various heroes of the past, figures who became divine on their death, these were taken as history. These were taken as actual events by Greeks and Macedonians, and Alexander, therefore, was really quite serious when he claimed to be a descendant of Heracles, an ancestor who actually joined the company of the gods and was worshipped in his own day. So that this notion of divinity was something that a great figure achieved as a result of great deeds on earth, and those great deeds on earth were a result of the favor of the gods, and that, in a sense, would make Alexander perhaps a son of Zeus in the extended sense of the word. It was also an indication of their remarkable abilities, something not quite just mortal, that was innate within them. And this was to be expected in a king who was descended from such illustrious heroes such as Achilles, Achilles' son Neoptolemus, Heracles, Perseus, the legendary king of Argos. All of these figures were therefore real ancestors to Alexander and to the nobility and the various infantry units of the Macedonian army. They all accept that this is true. What I wish to do in this lecture is look at a couple of issues, because this notion of Alexander, by the time he returned from the East, that is 10 years campaigning away from the Mediterranean world, ever farther away from the Mediterranean world, he apparently indicated to his Greek allies that he would not be displeased if he were voted divine honors. There wasn't any particular edict issued demanding divine honors, but we do have anecdotal material to suggest that the friends of Alexander in various Greek city-states moved such motions. Certainly one in Athens, another in Sparta was so moved. Well, how did we get to this point? Well, first, in the expedition to Asia, especially between 334 and 330 BC, that is, as Alexander conquered the western half of the Persian Empire, there is a very good record coming out of Arrian and supported by the other sources, notably Plutarch and Curtius Rufus. Diodorus Siculus doesn't provide much information because, as I've mentioned, he tends to write very much from the Persian perspective. He had access to sources by Greeks who had fought in the Persian army. Alexander very assiduously visited important shrines, sanctuaries, oracles, and he went about solving oracles and mysteries, riddles, as you might say, religious riddles, notably the Gordian knot, which all confirmed and magnified his sense of divine destiny. Before he set out to Asia, he had consulted the Oracle of Delphi very briefly in 336 BC and had convinced the Pythia, largely by coercion, to proclaim him invincible. But the most significant set of events came in the early stages of the expedition in spring of 334 BC when Alexander landed in Asia. He crossed at the Hellespont, and he crossed in such a way as he landed close to the site of Troy. Troy is being excavated today by a German and American archaeological team, and it has been excavated continuously since the early 20th century, following on the excavations of Schliemann. That excavation clearly is at the site where some type of war was fought in the late Bronze Age that gave rise to the legend of Troy. Alexander carried his copy of the Iliad, annotated by Aristotle, and he kept it with him. He kept it under his pillow each night when he went to bed, and he very, very much saw himself as the new Achilles. The Greeks were well aware of where this ancient site was, and when the site was resettled by Greek colonists, probably sometime in the 9th century BC, they actually didn't settle so much on the original settlement of Troy, where the so-called contemporary with the legendary war associated with Homer's epic, but rather outside of it, and there were a whole set of tourist attractions. Alexander went to these places. He took up a shield of Athena. We're not sure exactly what the shield was or how old it was, but he believed it to be the shield of the goddess Athena, the shield that had protected Achilles, and he carried it with him through Asia. Of course, he left his own arms and armor back at the sanctuary as an offering to Athena. He went out of his way to lay a wreath on the tomb of Achilles, while his friend Hephaestion laid a wreath on the tomb of Patroclus. And there are great barrows still there that were identified with the heroes, Patroclus, Achilles, Ajax. There were points apparently where Priam was supposed to be buried, the legendary king of Troy. Alexander carried out rites there. And these were done quite publicly and accompanied with games and competitions. And in most Greek-style games, there would be poetic competitions, there would be athletic competitions, again stressing the equal importance of both intellectual and physical prowess. This raised the spirits of the Macedonian army, and when they marched off to win their first battle at the Granicus, they undoubtedly were convinced that they were following the new Achilles, ho neos Achilleos, as one would say in Greek. As he moved through the cities of Ionia in that first year, and the great cities of the Phrygians and the Carians and the Lydians, that is, the native peoples of Western Asia Minor who were long in association with Greeks, Alexander went out of his way to appear at the great sanctuaries and offer the proper rites. At Ephesus, he ordered the rebuilding of the temple of Artemis, and he put his best engineers to work on it. Dinocrates, the man who eventually draws up the city of Alexandria, was commissioned to rebuild the Artemisium, the great temple to Artemis Ephesia, one of the seven wonders of the ancient world. The city of Smyrna, today the modern Turkish city of Izmir, had been destroyed sometime in the 7th century BC by a Lydian king, Alyattes. Alexander supposedly was sleeping beneath a palm tree, a plane tree, and the two protective divinities of the cities, they're called a nemesis, appeared in a dream. He ordered the rebuilding of the city and of its shrines. At Priene, the small city on the Bay of Miletus, across from the city of Miletus, Alexander, staying in the private house of a great individual, again was moved to expand and reconstruct the temple of Athena Polios. Now that's very significant. That is the guardian of Achilles. As Alexander made his way along the southern shore of Asia Minor, he came close to a town called Phaselis, a Rhodian colony on the eastern shore of Lycia. Lycia is this sort of little bulge in southwestern Turkey. It's an odd little region of its own, a very delightful pine-clad region, and the Lycians were long in association with the Greeks. And in making his way along the sea route, there was a danger of the army being washed out by the tides, and miraculously the waters parted. For what reasons, we're not sure, but this was taken as a divine sign. At Miletus, during the Great Siege, where he captured this tremendously important city and naval base, Parmenio noticed on the shores of Miletus an eagle, obviously the bird from Zeus, claimed that Alexander would win a naval battle. We should go to fight a naval battle. And Alexander said, no, you got it wrong, Parmenio. The eagle is on the beach. We will conquer the Persian navy from the land, that is by taking ports rather than risking a naval battle. He demobilized his fleet, and of course, he conducted that strategy. Now, whether that sign was actually seen by Parmenio, and the whole story could be just another one of those cases of Parmenio as the foil to Alexander, these stories circulated through the army and then transmitted back to the Greek world, and they were very, very much seen as indications, portents of Alexander's greatness. Very important in all of this in the first year was solving of the Gordian knot. I mentioned that earlier. It occurs sometime in 334, 333 BC when Alexander is wintering on the Great Plateau of Asia Minor, the region which was called in antiquity Phrygia. And I think it's worth reading at least a selection from Arrian. There are several accounts on how it took place, just to indicate how much of an impression this made on the ancients. And it's not sure whether this Gordian knot was really native to the Phrygians, whether it was far more important to Macedonians and Greeks, but nonetheless, it was a story that was henceforth circulated and was taken as the first indication of Alexander's lordship of Asia and his favor from the gods. And I read from Arrian. There was also another traditional belief about the wagon. This is the royal wagon of King Midas. According to this, the man who undid the knot which fixed its yoke was destined to be lord of Asia. The cord was made from bark of the cornel tree, and so cunningly was the knot tied that no one could see where it began or where it ended. For Alexander, then, how to undo it was indeed a puzzle. I mentioned, I believe, that the word is luo in Greek, which is a general word for loosening or untying. It has a number of different meanings. though he was nonetheless unwilling to leave it as it was, as his failure might possibly lead to public disturbances, by which Arian means that somehow Alexander was just not up to the job. And you have to understand, this is a young king, early in his 20s, who is claiming the favor of the gods on an expedition which to most of the Greek world looks totally crazy. Accounts of what followed differ. Some say that Alexander cut the knot with the stroke of his sword and exclaimed, "I have undone it." And technically, you could say that in Greek. But Aristobulus thinks that he took out the pin, a sort of wooden peg, which was driven right through the shaft of the wagon and held the knot together, and thus pulled the yoke away from the shaft. That probably circulates among various philosophical writers who were rather hostile to Alexander, and indicating that he kind of cheated on that way. I do not myself presume to dogmatize on the subject. In any case, when he and his attendants left the place where the wagon stood, the general feeling was the oracle about the untying of the knot had been fulfilled. That is, the Macedonians and Greeks there approved. Undoubtedly, so did the attendant Phrygians. Moreover, that very night there was lightning and thunder, a further sign from heaven. So Alexander, on the strength of all of this, offered sacrifice the following day to the gods, who had sent the sign from heaven and proclaimed the loosening of the knot. And there were a number of such performances through the Asian expedition. These could be claimed to be studied events. Nonetheless, they were believed. The demand to sacrifice to Melkart, who was identified with Heracles at Tyre, was a similar such event. He spent 6 months capturing the city of Tyre. Of course, that was strategic. But once the city was captured, he immediately made sacrifice to Melkart Heracles, and that, in effect, symbolized the success of the siege and no doubt raised the morale of the army. The visit to the oracle of Siwa and the discussions with the various Egyptian priests at Siwa, and the return to Egypt in almost a serene sense that he had somehow been in communication with the gods. All of these events early in the first 3 or 4 years of the campaigns in the regions of Asia Minor, the Levant, and Egypt, all of them confirmed within Alexander's own mind, and probably among the Macedonian nobility and the membership in the army, that their king truly was extraordinary, had the favor of the gods. Exactly what that would mean in later years would only be revealed in time. And I think ultimately Alexander felt that, yes, I will join the company of the Olympians on my death. And this was by no means an unusual conclusion. When he crosses the Tigris in 330 BC, we do not have the same stories and reports. And in that part of the world, in Iran, as I mentioned, the Persians, while not strict monotheists, is the best guess now in understanding the evolution of Zoroastrianism, nonetheless, the Persians had a tendency not to worship their gods in human form. At the great ritual city of Persepolis, which had been built by Darius I as sort of the ritual city to receive the tribute of the various subject peoples of the empire, the only real divine symbol is this winged sun figure that represents Ahura Mazda. It's been adapted from Babylonian iconography. And on the whole, you just don't find gods and religious symbols the way you would find around the rim of the Mediterranean world, or even in Babylonia, which is today middle Iraq. So that we don't have the same number of oracles and events going on. And Alexander in the Iranian world essentially had to succeed to the position of the great king. And the great king, for all of his favor from Ahura Mazda, was a mortal figure. Of course, this would change when he gets to India, where he finds various cults that he could identify with Heracles and Dionysus. These notions of Alexander's destiny, his divine destiny, his kingship, his communication with the gods, his descent from Achilles and Heracles. This has led to an enormous amount of speculation about who was Alexander. Was he a tyrant? Was he a conqueror? And to some extent, that is part of the theme of this course. It certainly was the theme of the very first lecture. The issue was already being debated in antiquity as to what exactly did Alexander believe. We will have several lectures dealing with the opposition to Alexander's claims to divinity, or at least criticism of these claims. And the authors that have come down to us in antiquity have drawn upon accounts that had very different views of Alexander's view of himself and the reasons why he came to believe in this divine destiny or this ultimate divinity. I have two passages here from Plutarch, which I think in some ways are some of the most sensible ways of looking at Alexander. And again, this is based on my own understanding of the sources, and there are very, very fine scholars, undoubtedly, who would not agree with my trust in Plutarch. But let me read these two passages and comment on them, and I think they give some idea of what we're dealing with. The first comes from Plutarch's Life of Alexander, fairly early in the account. In general, Alexander adopted a haughty and majestic bearing towards the barbarians, that is, towards the non-Greeks and Macedonians, as a man who was fully convinced of his divine birth and parentage. But towards the Greeks he was more restrained, and it was only on rare occasions that he assumed the manner of divinity. He made an exception when he wrote to the Athenians on the subject of Samos. Samos is a very important island in the Aegean, a very important naval base, and had been an Athenian clericy, that is essentially a colony, and said, "I would never have given you that free and glorious city. It was from your master at that time that you received it, and now hold it, my so-called father," referring to Philip. So-called meaning Alexander suggesting he might be a son of Zeus. By this he was referring to Philip, but some years later, when he had been wounded by an arrow and was in great pain, he remarked, "What you see flowing, my friends, is blood, and not the ichor which flows in the veins of the blessed immortals in heaven." And that is, I'm a mortal man. And Alexander, whatever he believed of his divine destiny or sense, did have some kind of sense of proportion. And when it was useful to him in dealing with the Athenians over a very, very touchy political issue, he might assert it. But on the other hand, he was perfectly capable of spoofing it, as the second comment indicates in that passage of Plutarch. After all, I bleed like my men do, and given the fact that Alexander carried numerous wounds from all of the great battles and sieges, it was obvious to most of the Macedonians that he was indeed mortal, certainly on the battlefield. This is another passage I would like to take from Plutarch, and again, Plutarch has these anecdotes which are very revealing on Alexander, and one really wishes they had a life of King Philip of Macedon, where we'd have similar types of anecdotes. We don't. Plutarch never wrote a life of King Philip. On another occasion, too, when there was a loud crash of thunder, and you have to remember thunder, brontos, is in the power of Zeus. Zeus has the thunderbolt. And all those in his company were frightened by it. Anaxarchus, the sophist, and that is a Greek intellectual at the court, asked him, that is Alexander, "Since you are the son of Zeus, could you make a noise like that?" And he's being a bit facetious. Alexander laughed and replied, "I have no wish to terrify my friends as you would have me do. It is you who apparently despise my table because, so you say, what you see on it is merely fish." Fish is the general protein of the Greek world. Macedonian nobles and kings are supposed to dine on beef, and that's a whole story in itself, and not a row of satraps' heads. Well, even better yet, the decapitated heads of one's opponents. For there is a story that this remark had been made by Anaxarchus when he saw a present of small fish that the king had sent to Hephaestion. That's Alex's best friend. He seemed to be disparaging and belittling those who undertake immense enterprises and run great risks in pursuit of their ambitions, which in the end leave them no happier or better able to enjoy themselves than other men. At any rate, it is evident from what I have said that Alexander did not allow himself to become vain or foolishly conceited because of his belief in his divinity, but rather used it to assert his authority over others, notably the various subject peoples of the empire. One thinks, for instance, of the Egyptians, where Alexander was hailed as Pharaoh, a term that means he who dwells in the great house, and along with that term went the belief that the Pharaoh was God on earth. Those two anecdotes by Plutarch are very telling, and they reveal to me a young king who had a very, very strong sense of proportion about what his divinity meant within the traditions of the Greek world. And as far as we can tell, and this can be debated in the final year, it never led to the type of arrogance and megalomania that is sometimes argued by very, very important and leading scholars. That the divinity, the claims of divinity, were essentially a loss of a touch of Alexander with reality, with his men. It would lead to certain types of opposition, criticism at court. There will be two mutinies we must discuss, and mutiny is a strong word. The first one is essentially the army refusing to go on because it's just exhausted, and there's good reasons for it. And even the second one, in 324 BC, again, is not a mutiny in the kind of sense that, let's kill our officers and raise the socialist flag. One thinks of the German Navy rebelling at Kiel in 1918, raise the socialist flag. No, nothing of the sort. Furthermore, these types of images that have been argued that Alexander's claims of divinity were just another indication of megalomania and growing, in some cases, even paranoia, that is, purging the court of any kind of critics or dissidents, that these images come from a generation of scholars who are writing in the shadow of the massive destruction of the Second World War, the genocide, the emergence of powerful modern dictators with a whole modern apparatus to persecute populations, as Adolf Hitler, Joseph Stalin. Furthermore, the notions that Alexander must insulate himself and make himself a supreme autocrat really run counter to the traditions of the Macedonian nobility and the way kings in Macedon ruled. They had to rule with the cooperation of nobles. We'll be getting into that issue when we deal with the trial of Philotas and the possible criticism arising from Alexander's claims that he has this divine connection, parentage, descent, destiny, however you want to describe it. I think a passage from Curtius Rufus, the Roman historian writing in the 1st century AD, is very telling on how Alexander was probably seen by his men. Again, you always have to filter Curtius through Roman eyes. He is a man writing from the perspective of the Roman Senate in the 1st century AD. But one point about Rufus that is very good is that he knew what real tyrants were. He undoubtedly knew who Nero was, and he may have known who Domitian was. He certainly saw Tiberius, and he understood what the power could do to a Roman princeps. And so his comments on Alexander are, I think, very, very revealing. The Macedonians, this is Rufus speaking, the Macedonians have a natural tendency to venerate their royalty. But even taking that into account, the extent of their admiration or their burning affection for this particular king, Alexander the Great, is difficult to describe. First of all, they thought his every enterprise had divine aid. Fortune was with him at every turn, and so even his rashness had produced glorious results. A very telling point, fortune, touche in Greek, fortuna in Latin. His age gave added luster to all his achievements, for though hardly old enough for undertakings of such magnitude, he was well up to them. Then there are things generally regarded as rather unimportant, but which tend to find greater approval among soldiers. The fact that he exercised with his men, that he made his appearance and dress little different from an ordinary citizen's, and that he had the energy of a soldier. And in Latin, miles, or the Greek equivalent would be stratiotes, that is the grunt, the guy in the field. These characteristics, whether they were natural or consciously cultivated, had made him in the eyes of his men as much an object of affection as of awe. And that is a very, very telling insight, that Alexander inspired both. Awe in his men for his great deeds, his exceptional position, his favor with the gods, and affection for the fact that they knew that he fought and shared their hardships at every point. Arrian goes into great detail after the great battles at Granicus, at Issus, at Arbela, or Gaugamela, the two names of the same battle, that Alexander, after the battle, moved among his men and allowed all of his men to explain the wounds they received, to give their versions of their bravery, even if exaggerated. And he knew who his men were, and he could point them out. And he rewarded them publicly. He reminded them of their greatness. And he had an immense ability to remember details, and especially the details of his veterans. And it endeared him to them because they understood that he actually knew who each of them was. This is a trait that one would find also with Julius Caesar and with Napoleon. And it is a characteristic of all great commanders that they could project both this awe and affection at the same time. And for such stories like this to circulate, even if they've been embroidered and in some cases invented, it is very, very hard to put aside this whole tradition of this heroic king and simply argue that the claims for divinity were nothing more than indications of a megalomania, a psychosis, an aspiration, an aspiring for total power as some type of totalitarian dictator based solely on fear. As Alexander moved east, I noted that in the Iranian world, those images of divinity were not conveniently located. And we will discuss two incidents while fighting in that region where some of his generals apparently had qualms about what Alexander was doing. That included his adoption of Persian ceremony and certain elements of Persian dress, and the introduction of a ceremony known as proskonesis, which is performed in various ways. It is a form of one abasing himself before the great king of Persia. And in the Greek world, such types of rituals would only be offered to the gods. And when Alexander very briefly attempts to introduce it at his court in 327 BC, it is met with opposition, particularly by Greeks at the court, and he has to withdraw it. And it is still debated whether Alexander intended this ceremony simply for his Persian subjects, that is, it's simply good manners that Persians salute their new great king this way, or that it was to be extended to the whole court, and Alexander was aware of the ambiguous nature of this ceremony. That is, to Persians it was good manners to the king, but to Greeks and Macedonians it represented, in effect, worship. In any event, the ceremony was withdrawn, and it was not demanded in later years. Alexander also finds that in Central Asia, he comes to the conclusion, after he slays his friend Clytus, who had saved him at the Battle of Granicus, that he needed also to propitiate the god Dionysus. In the invasion of India in the years 327 to 325 BC, Alexander went out of his way to reenact exploits or to exceed the feats of both Heracles and Dionysus. He now had added Dionysus to his various examples. Exempla would be the Latin term for that. And the whole creation of the image of Dionysus as coming from the east, from India, in a cart drawn by panthers as success, the great triumph of Dionysus in the east, a son of Zeus who again joined the gods. That imagery goes back to Alexander's conquest in India. And he very often identified shrines of the Hindu gods Shiva or Indra or Krishna as local versions of Dionysus. And at one city in particular, a city that is called Greek Nisa, he saw ivy growing there. Well, that's sacred to Dionysus. Ergo, this is a city of Dionysus, and he gave the city every sort of benefit. Those types of images, again, were very real. When the army emerged from the Gedrosian Desert in 324 BC, perhaps the hardest marching through the whole of the expedition, he celebrated as a veritable Dionysiac festival. They arrived in triumph back in Persia, almost the way Dionysus was conceived. And this image of Dionysus as the youthful conqueror from the east goes back to Alexander. It is not in earlier Greek art. First of all, in earlier Greek art, they really didn't know where India was. And second, it is transmitted to the Hellenistic and Roman age and becomes a favorite theme on sarcophagi, wall paintings, and the like. So in understanding Alexander's own position and his divinity, it is still a question that to some extent reflects what the reader believes in the sources and what the reader's own experiences are. Perhaps one of the most provocative studies arguing for the autocratic and tyrannical Alexander has been done by Bosworth, Alexander in the East, a very, very well-written work and certainly cogently argued. And their comparisons are made to Cortez's conquest of Mexico in 1519, 1521. And Bosworth, in effect, sums up a whole tradition since 1945 in which Alexander is seen as that megalomaniacal tyrant and veritable dictator. On the other side, of course, there is that heroic tradition of W. Tarn, going back essentially to the 19th century, and I'm by no means a subscriber to that theory or that image. Alexander could, on occasion, act swiftly, decisively, and brutally to secure his position. All Macedonian kings could. But in the end, I do think, and I've mentioned this at the start of the class, that Ulrich Wilken's work on Alexander, stressing the mystical and the religious side of the king, the great yearning and pothos, which moved him to conduct these various acts, to carry out visits to the shrines, to emulate his ancestors, and led him to that conclusion that somehow he was divine. I think that is the closest in understanding Alexander. For not to do so would require us to take all of the anecdotes out of Arrian, Curtius, Plutarch, that in one way or another see this king as remarkable, extraordinary, and you would have to toss those stories out. And then what you are left with is the bare narrative of a Macedonian army marching some 10 years through Asia and returning under the command of a supreme autocrat and tyrant. I don't think that is possible. I think that the Macedonian soldiers who participated in that expedition and reached Persia, actually Susa and Babylon, by 324 BC, believed that they had served under the greatest hero of all times and had conducted the greatest exploits of all time. And the greatest significance in their life is they had served their king.